You're very welcome. Thank you so much for having me. It's lovely to be here with you today, and thank you for that lovely introduction. So yes, today what I'm going to show you is basically a slightly more grown-up version, and only slightly, of the show that I do to help young people understand learning and memory. But we're going to talk about how you can apply it as teachers. So I am going to share my screen first of all. So hopefully that works and you can see my nice big Braintastic Science logo. Okay, great. So to join in with this session, it's going to be really interactive. Hopefully you're going to test your memories, try out some techniques, see what works for you. So if you can grab a pen and paper, because you're going to need those a little bit later. So just so you have a bit of time to organise that. Hopefully you've all got one in your classroom or wherever you are. But to start with, we're going to do a little memory test. And this one, I don't want you to write anything down. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you a list of words. They're going to pop up on the screen one at a time. I'm also going to read them out. Just listen to them, look at them, try and remember them, and we're going to come back to them a little bit later. Okay, here we go. So the first word is bed, dream, pillow, yawn, duvet, night, tired. Okay, so we're going to come back to those words a little bit later. But first up, I want to tell you a little bit about your brain. So I've got a picture here of a human brain, and this isn't a real human brain. Real ones look a lot squishier than that, but it's a fairly good representation. And inside your brain, you've got some different types of brain cells. There's brain cells called neurons, which look a little bit like this. They've got all those kind of frondy bits at either end, and they're the ones that send and receive information. So they send it around your body, they receive it from your senses, and they process all that information. We also have a load of different types of cells known as glial cells, which do all sorts of different really important things, generally kind of supporting the neurons and making sure they can function properly. So inside our brains, we've got about 86 billion of these neurons, and they can make around 100 trillion connections. So that means that inside your brain, there's about 1,000 times more connections than there are stars in the Milky Way galaxy, which I think is pretty incredible. So your brain is this incredibly complex thing made up of all these different cells and all these different connections. And this is a kind of representation of what neurons look like. So what we've got here is we've got two neurons. And the way neurons communicate is they send a signal along from one end of the neuron to the other, and that's an electrical signal. And then to get to the second neuron, the next one in the chain, usually it releases chemicals called neurotransmitters. And they travel across a little gap, which is known as a synapse, activate the second neuron, and the signal carries on. So let's say we're looking at something. We activate cells in the retina. They send their electrical signal to the next neuron, release chemicals, activate the next one. It goes on to the next one, onto the next one, all the way back until it reaches the vision part of our brain in this long chain. And it's these synapses that are particularly important when it comes to learning. And we're going to come back to that in a minute. But before we do, I want to show you what is possibly the simplest form of learning, and it's known as adaptation. So what I'd like you to do is have a look at this picture, look around the edge. You should be able to see kind of pink blobs that are disappearing one at a time. Now focus your eyes on the cross in the middle for a moment and see what happens. Actually, why don't you write in the comments if you can see anything happening, because I'd love to know if this is working on everyone. So does anything change when you keep your eyes focused on that cross? Is it still on the screen? Because I've just opened the chat. Has that made it go off the screen?
Nope, okay. We're still good, Ginny. Still good.
We're still good. Wonderful. And I've got some answers coming in. We can see some green blobs going clockwise, a green green dot and the pink blobs are disappearing. Exactly. Yes, so when you stare at that cross, the pink dot should start to fade away. And in their place, you see one green dot going in the opposite direction. So this is an example of adaptation. And what that is basically if something is the same, your brain starts ignoring it. So when you keep your eyes still and focused on that cross, the bits of the areas of your retina, the back of your eye that are sending signals to your brain about the pink dots, kind of give up doing that, and your brain starts ignoring any signals that do come in, because if it's not changing, then it's not important. So you adapt to things that are the same in the environment. And that's why if you walk into a room sometimes and there's a strong smell, you might then notice that 10 minutes later you can't smell it anymore, because your brain has learnt that that smell didn't mean anything important and it doesn't need to pay attention to it. The green blob is interesting, and that's to do with the fact that our colour receptors don't just tell us exactly what colour they're seeing, they tell us what the ratios of different colours are. And effectively, we get something called an after image, which means that we always see the opposite to whatever colour we were looking at before, because say the neurons that were telling your brain about the kind of reddish pink color, they've stopped signaling as much. Green is the opposite to that. So when there's nothing there, you see the opposite, because of it's what's called an opponency process. I can go into that a little bit more if people are interested, but generally your brain starts seeing the opposite of anything that it's stared at for a long time, because of the way the neurons kind of work in relation to each other. So this is sort of a form of learning. It's adaptation. Our brains kind of got used to something and stopped telling us about it. But it's not really what we think of when we're talking about learning in schools, or when we're talking about teaching. When it comes to that, we're really talking mostly about facts or about skills, depending on what kind of subject you're teaching. And our understanding of fact learning was really nicely summed up in 1949 by a scientist called Hebb. And he said, neurons that fire together wire together. So what that means is that the more you activate a pair of neurons together, the stronger the connection between them becomes. And this really is the basis of all kind of learning in the brain. So if we were to zoom in on that synapse that I showed you in this picture here, we'd see something that looks a little bit like this at the very end of it. So you've got the signal coming in, those neurotransmitters being released. At the end of the second neuron, we've got those little Y-shaped things, which we call receptors. They detect the chemicals, and when they detect enough of them, they send their signal. Now, before learning has happened, that signal can get across that synapse, but it takes a little while. What happens when we repeatedly activate pairs of neurons over and over again is that things start to change. So for one thing, the first neuron can actually start making more neurotransmitter. So when the signal comes in, more of those chemicals are released into the synapse, and that makes it easier for the signal to travel across. The second neuron can also grow more receptors, and that means it's easier to detect that chemical when it's coming in. And the combination of those two means that the signal travels across the neuron more quickly than it did before you learnt that thing. And this is why learning things makes them easier. When you first do something, it's really tricky, but the longer you practice it for, the more times you revise it, the easier it becomes, because you're creating and strengthening these connections between neurons. And if you do something enough, neurons can even grow new dendrites, those frondy bits at the end, and connect up in new ways. So they can form these kind of interlocking networks where the information has lots of different pathways it can travel down. Again, that makes it even stronger and more likely that you'll remember that information in the future. So I want to give you a little example now of how quickly you can learn something that you hopefully haven't done before. So if you'd like to join in, what I'd like you to do is stay sitting down, but lift your right leg off the floor slightly and start rotating your foot in clockwise circles. Now, keeping that going, take your right hand and draw a 6 in the air, starting at the top, just in front of you. What happens? Have a go and tell me in the chat what happens when you try to draw the 6. What happens to your foot? Steve's foot started going in the opposite direction, as has William's. And Charlie's, the foot's following the hand. Yes. So this is a really tricky thing to do. But what I want you to do is keep going. Keep practicing it. Yes, Paul's discovered that if he writes his 6 backwards, his foot will keep going the right way. Exactly. So I'll tell you a little bit about why that is, but keep doing it while I'm talking. So our brains are divided into 2 hemispheres, and when it comes to movement, the left hemisphere controls the right half of our brain, our body, and the right hemisphere controls the left-hand side. Now, it's really difficult for the movement area of the brain on the same side to make one of our arm go in one direction and our foot go in the opposite direction. And that's effectively what we're trying to do here, because our foot's going clockwise, but a 6 is anti-clockwise. You're trying to do opposite things with really close areas of the brain, and that's really tricky. But hopefully, as you're practicing it, you're noticing that's starting to change. Has anyone managed to do it yet, to keep their foot going clockwise while they're drawing the 6? Anyone managed to do it yet? Roughly? Yeah, almost? Just once. Brilliant. So you are noticing that the more you practice this, the better you get at it. And that's changing connections in your brain. This is something you've probably never done before. And it's the equivalent of the patting your head and rubbing your tummy thing. But most of us have tried that before. So I use this one instead. It's difficult when you first do it. You have to really concentrate on it. But the more times you do it, the more you practice it, the easier it becomes. And if you were to practice it every day for a month, you'd become super good at it, and it could be your new party trick, because our brains can change, they're flexible, and they can learn new things. Brilliant. So that's the kind of basic cellular stuff of what's going on in our brain when we learn new things. Now we're going to zoom out a little bit and look at the whole brain. And I like to think of the brain as a whole as a bit like a really thick forest. So when you're learning something new, it's like you're trying to find a new path through the forest. You have to kind of cut down branches and push back brambles, and it's really hard work. But the more times you walk down that pathway, the more times you do that thing or revise that fact, the wider and more open the pathway becomes. And if you come back to it regularly, it will stay wide and open. So what's actually going on in the brain? Oh, I've lost the little thingy where I can see you. There you are. Let me just go back to full screen. For some reason I can't see the little Teams thing of you all in the corner anymore. But I think that's okay. Someone shout if you can't see me or anything like that.
We've still got you.
So
We've still got you.
You still got me. Perfect. Sorry, I'm a Zoom person, so Teams is is slightly different setup. Okay, great. So we're going to look at the parts of the brain that are involved in learning and memory now. And there are lots of different parts, but one of them that is really vital is called the hippocampus. And it's buried kind of deep inside the brain. So this is a picture as if I cut your brain down the middle, cut your skull between your nose, and we're looking inside that cut bit of the brain. And the hippocampus is vital for forming new memories. And we know this because there have been some cases of people who have had damage to their hippocampus and they've been completely unable to form any new memories. They still have long-term memories that they stored before the damage happened, but they can't form any new ones. So our best current theory is that long-term memories are stored distributed across the cortex, the whole of the outside layer of our brain. What we think happens is that first we get that cellular consolidation, which is that process I told you about of connections between neurons forming and strengthening. And we think that that happens initially in the hippocampus. But then over the next few weeks or months, there's another process that happens that sort of moves that memory from the hippocampus to the cortex, and it's consolidated again, stored again in your cortex. We think your hippocampus sort of repeatedly activates regions of the cortex, forming those new connections to form and strengthen. And this happens a lot of the time during sleep, also during rest, kind of any time your brain is having some downtime to process what it's taken in during the day. So we know that if your hippocampus is damaged, that process doesn't work. They can't store the new memories in the cortex. So it'd be nice if that was the end of things. We've formed memories in the hippocampus, then we've moved them to the cortex for long-term storage. They're there, we can reactivate and call on them whenever we like. But unfortunately, the brain is rarely that simple. So what I'd like to do now is I would like you to think back to that list of words that I read you at the beginning. I'm going to read another list of words now, and all you have to do is shout yes or no, depending on whether you think that word was on the original list or whether you think it wasn't on the original list. So yes if you heard it before, no if you didn't. And if you can pop your microphones on for this so I can hear your answers, that would be wonderful. Okay, so here is our list of words. Bed.
Yes.
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 Lamp.
No.
No.
Dream.
Yes.
Yes.
Pillow.
Yes.
Yes.
Rose.
No.
No.
Sleep.
No.
No.
Ooh, a little bit of disagreement on sleep. Brilliant. That is generally what we find with this test. Lots of people will say that they remember hearing the word sleep on that first list, and it actually wasn't there. So these were the words that I showed you, and you might notice that they all link to sleep. And this tells us something about how our brain stores information. We don't store everything individually. We tend to kind of extract the gist of information. So it's much more efficient to remember that you heard a list of words that all relate to sleep than to store them each individually. But that can implant what we call a false memory. And when this study is done in the lab, we find people with these quite strong memories where they're really convinced that they saw the word sleep, even though they didn't. There's some fascinating research from a scientist called Elizabeth Loftus, who implanted really quite complicated false memories in people, including making them believe that they got lost in a shopping centre when they were children. And she did that by reactivating a real memory and then getting people to imagine things. So what this tells us, and what we now know from cellular research as well, is that when we recall a memory, it enters this state where it's a little bit flexible, where it can be changed. And if you add new information at that point, it can get stored again in the cortex, mixed in with the old information. And it's really hard to tell them apart the next time you recall them. Now, this can be a bad thing because it can lead to these kind of false memory cases. It's even been linked to some cases of false convictions in courtrooms and things. But it can also be really useful. As a teacher, it means that if you can get your students to reactivate a memory they already have stored and then add some new information into that, it's almost like a shortcut. And that's one of the reasons that linking things that you're teaching them to something they've learned before can be a really effective method. So that's the kind of neuroscience, that's what's going on inside our brains. But when it comes to learning and memory, actually a lot of what we understand comes from psychology research rather than neuroscience research. So psychologists like to break memory down into different types. And one of the ways of doing this is to talk about short-term memory and long-term memory. So what we're going to do now is we're going to do a little test of your short-term memories. So I'm going to read you out a list of letters. Then I'm going to get you to sit in silence for 20 seconds, which is going to be horribly uncomfortable on a Zoom call because time always feels much longer when you're sitting on a Zoom call. And then you're going to write down those letters. Okay, so I will read you the letters out. Here we go. F, K, P, A, B, R, M, T. Okay, I'm going to start a stopwatch and you're going to sit quietly for 20 seconds. Okay, time's up. You can write down as many of the letters as you can remember. Order doesn't matter, so just write down as many as you can. I'll give you a few seconds to do that. Okay, in this next round, we're going to do the same thing, but in the 20-second break, I'm going to give you a little maths task to do. Okay, so I'll read you the letters first and then tell you what the task is. So don't write them down at this point. Your letters are E, J, N, D, S, V, L, H. Now I'd like you to start at 1,000 and subtract 7, and then subtract 7 again, and then again, and keep going during this 20-second break. Okay, you can write down your letters now. See how many you can remember. Okay, we're going to do one final experiment. It's back to the same as the first one. So I'll read you your letters, then we'll have 20 seconds of silence, and then you can write them down. Okay, so here are your letters. B, L, A, C, K, C, A, T. 20 seconds of silence. Okay, you can write down the letters from that last experiment. So once you've done that, I'd like you to have a think about which experiment you found the hardest, which experiment you found the easiest, and why you think that might be. So I am going to switch over so that I can see your so yes, tell me which one you found hardest, which one you found easiest, etc. Jeremy found the last one easiest because he noticed that it spelt a word. It spelt out black cat. Exactly, yes. David found the middle one the hardest, and so did Sandra because of the different tasks to do. Yes, exactly. Brilliant. So yeah, this is exactly what we find. We find the did anyone actually, before I move on, did anyone notice that they were doing anything during that first gap in order to keep it in their brains? Did anyone have any techniques? Repeating the letters. Yes, exactly. So that's a really common thing that we do. Ah, Sandra was trying to make a word. Brilliant. So you were ahead of the game on that third one, or trying to make a pattern, making them into a sentence. Brilliant. So we've got so many different strategies that we can do to try and hold things into short-term memory. The problem is that if we're distracted, so like in the second one where we had a different task to do, then we can't use these strategies. So this tells us something about our short-term memory. It tells us that our short-term memory is limited and that it's easily lost. Oh, sorry, I was going to show you the answers so that you can check how many you got right on each of them if you'd like to. So these are the answers. Yeah, so our short-term memory is quite limited. It's very easily lost if we get distracted. It can only store a certain amount of information, and scientists have found that depending on the type of information, it's somewhere between 5 and 9 for most people, for most types of information. And it's really only for storage. There are things we can do to help. So one of them is called chunking, and that's effectively what we did in experiment 3. So rather than having to remember 8 separate letters, you just had to remember 2 words. So that's fewer pieces of information, and therefore it's easier. So that's our short-term memory, and I've used that fish as an illustration because we're all a little bit like Dory from Finding Nemo when it comes to our short-term memory. As soon as we're distracted, whatever it was we were thinking about goes out of our brains. We also have what's known as working memory, which is super important in school. And that's used to manipulate information that we have stored in our short-term memory. So, for example, when you were doing the maths task, you had to remember the number you were on and then subtract 7 from it. And that uses your short-term memory to remember the number and your working memory to do that process. We know that kids who have problems with working memory can have all sorts of issues in school, partly because a lot of the time in schools, we have to remember multi-step instructions. Even if it's in very young kids, they might be told to close their books, put them in their drawers, get their coats and come and sit down on the mat. Now that's 4 pieces of information to keep in working memory. And if a kid's struggling with that, they might get to the first one and then completely forget what they're meant to be doing next. And then they might either get in trouble for not listening or not get to the learning activity if the learning activity is the last one on the list. So supporting kids' working memories can be really valuable in school. But what we're aiming for when we're trying to get students to remember things is to get that information into our long-term memory. Because our long-term memory is much more robust than our short-term memory. It can stay there for a long time, and it's also not limited like our short-term memory is. There are almost an infinite number, any mathematicians will argue here, but from a biologist's perspective, there's almost an infinite number of different possible connections that your brain can make in the cortex to store memories. So your long-term memory can effectively store as many things as you want it to. So what we want to do is we want to get information into long-term memory, and then we want to be able to get it out again. So to get it in, we have to create those connections and make sure they're really secure. And then to get it out again, we have to make sure we can reactivate those connections. So what we're going to do for the last sort of 20 minutes or so of the session is some kind of tips and tricks and techniques that we can use to help people store and recall information. But first, I want to play another game. So this is a version of the tray game or Kim's game, as it's sometimes called. I'm going to give you 20 seconds to look at a picture, and then I'm going to show you a different picture, and you have to try and work out which objects have changed. So this first time, don't do anything special, just spend 20 seconds looking at it, and then we'll try and work out what's changed. Okay, here you go. Okay, so do you want to jot down on the paper? In a minute, I'm going to show you the second picture, and I want you to jot down on the paper what you think has changed. I'm going to give you 20 seconds to look at this one as well. Actually, maybe 10. Okay, so who thinks that they spotted something that was missing from that second picture? We've got 1 vote for the Scrabble trial. Brilliant. We've got 1 vote for the brush. Yes, it's actually a nail brush, but I'll give you that. Can I put the second picture up again? I can, yeah. And we got a vote for the mirror. So yes, brilliant. Between all of you, you got all of them. But how many individual people got all of them? I'm going to guess not many of you spotted all 3 missing items. So what we're going to do this time is we're going to play another round, exactly the same. But this time, what I want you to do during your first 20 seconds of looking at the picture is to try and make up a little story that groups together several items. So pick 3 or 4 of the items and think about how you might use them together, or a story or a reason that they might appear together, and do that for ideally all of the items, but certainly as many as you can in that 20 seconds. Then we're going to do exactly the same thing again, see if you can work out what was missing. Okay, so here is your next set of items, and I will give you 20 seconds on the clock. Okay, couple more seconds and time's up. Okay, so now I'm going to show you the picture with some of them missing and see if you can work out all 3 things that are missing this time. Okay, we've got a couple of people said matches. Someone got spoon, brilliant. I feel like I'm getting more words in this time than I was last time. But no one's got the last one yet, which is interesting. There's one more. Matches and spoon, popular. So the other one that was missing is the paperclip. So from the first picture, it's sort of in the middle there, and then it's gone. Okay, so hopefully, obviously science never works perfectly, but hopefully you found that you remembered more of the items more easily in the second condition than you did in the first condition. Yes, William says he's not sure what everything was. I appreciate that. I had some weird items. It's remarkably hard to find that many items that are small enough to take a photograph of. So yes, that is a little bit challenging. So yeah, hopefully you found that in the second version, where you were making up a story, grouping things together, that meant that you remembered more of the items. And there's a few different reasons for that. Sorry, Steve's asking, what was the thing with inside gear teeth? Oh, it's a cookie cutter. You're obviously not a baker, Steve. That is a cookie cutter, or pastry cutter. So yes, so in the version where you were grouping them, you're doing a few different things which are going to help your memory. First of all, you're coming up with a story, and that means you're processing the information more deeply. So in the first time, you were kind of looking at the items, I guess, naming them, trying to work out what they were. But the second time, you were really thinking about them. What are they used for? Where might I find them? How can I group them together? And that deeper processing helps store the information in your brain. You were also putting them into groups, which is a form of chunking. And it then allows those links allow remembering one item to trigger your memory of the next one. So that gives you a little bit of an advantage. So we've got, the deeper processing, the chunking it into groups, the creating of links, and using those as triggers. So those are some really good kind of ways that you can use all of those different techniques together just by quite a simple thing of making up a story about some items. There's lots of different ways actually that you can use triggers to help you remember things. So triggers can also, as well as another item or another piece of information, they can also be things in the environment. So one of my favorite studies on learning and memory was done on divers, and scientists gave divers word lists to learn, and they then asked them to recall them. And sometimes they had to recall them and learn them underwater, and sometimes on land. And they found that the divers remembered the lists that they learned underwater better if they recalled them underwater, and the ones that they learned on land better if they recalled them on land. So we think your setting, your environment can provide a clue as to what it is you're trying to remember. And you might have experienced this if you've ever gone upstairs for something and realized when you get there that you can't remember what it was you went up for. But as soon as you come back downstairs, you instantly remember it. So the environment of downstairs triggered that memory. And other things can be triggers too. So even your emotions, if you're stressed or not stressed or noise going on in the background, those can act as triggers, but equally they can act as blockers. And this is probably something that happens in exams a lot when people go blank, because if they're very stressed, their internal environment is very different to when they were learning. And that can make it really hard to remember information that they learnt when they were in a less stressed state. So I'm going to give you another example now, and this is actually one of the oldest memory techniques there is around. And some of you will probably have come across this before, and it's called a memory palace or a mind palace. And this is a brilliant technique that uses triggers and links to help you learn lists of information and learn them in order. So I'm going to teach you the 10 biggest countries in South America in order of population size via a mind palace. So what you need to do is close your eyes and imagine a building you're really familiar with. So easiest is probably your house. And you're going to really imagine walking through your house, and at different points we're going to place images linking to each of those countries. Then to recall them, we're going to go back to the beginning, walk through again, and hopefully they'll come to mind. So close your eyes, imagine your house. First of all, I want you to walk into your kitchen and imagine you see a giant Brazil nut, that's our first country, Brazil, sitting at your kitchen table. It's drinking a cup of Colombian coffee. Really smell that coffee. It smells amazing. So you go to the kettle to make yourself a cup. But when you get there, you notice that the kettle is dancing the Argentine tango with the toaster. So that's our next country, Argentina. Next, you go into the living room where you find Paddington Bear, who hopefully everyone knows is from Deepest Darkest Peru. And Paddington is sitting on your sofa and he's drawing a Venn diagram, and that's Venn diagram for Venezuela. Now, the good thing is that memory palaces work really well even when the links are very silly, so bear with me. Next to Paddington, there's a bowl of chili peppers for chili, and he's picking them up and biting into them. So you eat one as well and you feel that spicy flavour on your tongue. You turn around and you notice that on the handle of your living room door, there's this weird oozy green stuff. You realise that it's ectoplasm. So that's ectoplasm on the door. That's Ecuador. Bear with me, they were getting a little bit tenuous at this point. You carefully step round it and head upstairs when you nearly trip over a woman sitting on the top step with a bowl on her head and a huge name badge saying, "Hi, my name's Olivia." So that's Bolivia. You push past her and go into your bedroom when you realise your duvet has been replaced with a multicoloured parachute. That's parachute for Paraguay. You look down and you realise you're wearing one too. Uruguay. That one was hard. Okay, so those are our 10 countries. So now if you could all please turn your microphones back on. I'm going to walk you back through the memory palace and I'd like you to shout the country when we get to it. Okay, so we're going to walk into the kitchen. What do we see?
Brazil.
Brazil nut. Brilliant. And what's he drinking?
Colombian.
Colombian coffee.
Coffee.
Then you turn to the kettle and you see
Venezuela. No.
Argentina.
Argentina.
Oh, I got
Yeah,
Venezuela.
that's the one.
Oh, dear.
Brilliant. Next, we're going to go into the living room where we find
Peru.
Paddington from Peru. And what's he drawing?
Venezuela.
Venezuela. Brilliant. And then you bite into a
Chile.
chili pepper. You turn around and you see
Ecuador.
Ecuador. Well done. You remembered my very silly way of remembering Ecuador. Then you head upstairs and who's there?
Bolivia.
Olivia. You go into the bedroom and you see
Paraguay.
and
Uruguay.
brilliant. Give yourselves a round of applause.
No, I did really badly.
But hopefully you did better than if I just listed off 10 countries and then asked you to recall them. And that's where memory palaces can be really helpful, when you have to remember those kind of lists of information in order. Okay, so we don't have a huge amount of time, so I'm going to whiz through the last couple of techniques that are super important, and then we'll have some time for questions. So there are lots of other things we can use. We can use rhymes or songs, which act really well as triggers. We can use associations to increase depth and create links. We can use visualizations, like in the memory palace, which increase depth. And we can use things like mnemonics to act as triggers. But really, the most important thing is repetition. So the more you repeat something, the more you're effectively walking down this pathway through the forest, creating those connections in the brain, and the stronger they become. But there are important things as to how you repeat them. And one of them is to do with spacing. So a researcher called Ebbinghaus in the 1880s taught himself random words and then tracked how quickly he forgot them. And he found these beautiful curves, and you can see how steeply it drops off at the beginning. But he found that if you revised it, so you're bringing that memory back up to the top, it drops off less quickly. And each time you revise it, you kind of make that curve much more shallow. But you want to revise at the right point. If you space your learning appropriately, you can get the same amount of learning for half as much revision time, which I think is pretty amazing. The problem is the spacing is quite personal. So the same spacing doesn't necessarily work for everyone, but generally you want to revise when you've just started forgetting something. Usually that means within the first 24 hours, and then you can start spacing it out more. So maybe coming back to it after a week and then a month, and that would kind of help with this forgetting. And this works for a huge range of different types of information, including facts, skills, motor learning, all sorts of different things. When it comes to how we're revisiting the information, the other thing that works really well is testing. So when you are asking a student to just reread information they've already come across, they'll get a feeling of familiarity. It'll ring a bell, and that makes them think that they're learning really effectively. But what actually works a lot better is getting them to practice recalling the information, because that really activates those neurons again, and that's what strengthens them, whereas that feeling of familiarity doesn't create those connections quite as effectively. It's a form of active learning, which I'm sure most of you have come across, and active learning is, as I say, all about getting the brain working hard. This can be quite challenging. Students don't really like it because it's hard work. So it's really important to explain to them that when something feels difficult, that means their brain's working hard, and that means they're more likely to store it. You do also need to provide feedback and make sure that they get the correct answers after the testing. But it's the practice of practicing recall that really strengthens those connections. But really, the most important thing that your students can do to help themselves with learning and memory is getting enough sleep. And that's often really not easy, particularly for teenagers. But we know that you can't learn well if you're sleep deprived. Your brain isn't in the right state to form those connections, and your attention and focus really suffer. We also know that sleeping after you've learnt something is really important to make sure that information stays in the brain. So Ebbinghaus, who I mentioned earlier, noticed this back in the 1800s, that there was a jump in his retention if he'd slept. So what we think is going on is that when you're awake, your brain is primed to take in information and to encode it, to do that initial bit of storage. But it's when you sleep that your brain kind of sifts through all that information, decides what's important and should be stored for the long term, and what it can do without. It also fits that information in with things you already know, processes it, extracts the gist of it. And actually, people often wake up feeling that they understand something in a way that they didn't before they went to sleep. And that's because their brain has been working on it throughout the night. The problem for a lot of teenagers is that the school day just doesn't really suit their natural wake-sleep cycle. We all release a chemical called melatonin in the evenings, which makes us feel sleepy. But teenagers release that chemical about 2 hours later than adults do. And that means they naturally want to go to bed and get up later than we do. We then force them to get up really early for school, and then wonder why they're constantly tired and grumpy, because basically they're jet lagged all of the time. And this is an issue that is not an easy one to solve, because moving schools timings later has actually shown to have quite a lot of benefits for schools, from performance to reducing fights to, in America where a lot of kids drive to school, reducing road accidents. But it doesn't really fit in with the sort of working day that adults have to do and with younger kids. So it's not an easy solution. But I certainly think it's important to kind of explain to teenagers that even if they don't feel sleepy, it's important for them to get those 8-9 hours sleep a night so that their brains can be at their best. So yeah, I just think sleep is something that's really underrated, and there's this kind of belief that staying up late cramming will help you for an exam, whereas actually the best thing you can do before an exam is get a good night's sleep. So that's something I always like to stress when I'm talking to young people. So we've whizzed through a whole bunch of different kind of tips and tricks at the end there and linked them back, hopefully, to what I told you at the beginning about how memories are stored in the brain, how those connections between neurons are made, and how we can help keep them really nice and secure. But I would love to take any questions you might have in the last 10 minutes, or if there's anything you'd like me to expand on, I'm happy to do that as well.
Thank you very much, Ginny. That was an absolutely fascinating, very entertaining and enjoyable session as well. And I've certainly picked up some tips there, which will help. I think we've got a question from William, who's got his hand up. So if you can fire away, William.
Hi, Ginny. I know your talk was very much about learning, but I just wondered what you thought about instinct.
In what sort of context?
In the context that we see it in humans, but it's more common, and you see it more in animals, but about sort of almost like things that are learnt before the animal is born. So for instance, an animal,
yes, okay, so sort of
so
like
an animal
innate...
can get up and walk before it ever needs to learn to walk.
Yeah, so I would say that humans have less innate or instinctual information than any other animal, basically. One of the reasons for this is that we're basically born before we're fully brewed. Our brains are really underdeveloped when babies are born, and they basically can't do anything for themselves, which, as you say, compared to other animals which can run around and survive on their own straight away. But that's actually also our strength. So our brains are incredibly flexible, and they're flexible throughout our lives. But as babies and children, they are so flexible, so changeable. And that's why you can take a baby that was born in one part of the world, take it to a new part of the world, and it can learn to behave completely differently. Most animals can't do that. If you take a lion to the North Pole, a baby lion to the North Pole, it's not going to be able to survive, even if you take its parent lions as well, because it can't learn to change its behavior. Whereas humans have this amazing capacity to learn to change our behavior based on our environment, based on what's going on around us. And that means that, yes, we have less of those instinctual things, innate things, but we have more flexibility and more ability to learn and change and soak up the environment and yeah, respond to it.
Thank you, William. Just one question from me, Ginny. Is there any evidence that people's short-term memories are deteriorating due to the increased number of distractions that we all have in modern life, such as constant notifications? And if that is the case, are there any specific tips you could offer?
Yeah, so I think the thing that our constant notification stuff have more of an impact on than our short-term memories is we end up putting ourselves in a situation where we have to constantly switch tasks. And there is an energy barrier when we need to switch tasks. The human brain likes doing one thing at a time. And as humans, we think that we can multitask, but actually we can't. What we're doing when we're multitasking is we're switching between two different things. So if we're reading Twitter and watching TV, what we're actually doing is watching a bit of TV, then reading a bit of Twitter, then watching a bit of TV. You can't actually really do two things at once. So when we do that in the working day, we end up being less efficient than if we did one thing for half an hour and then a different thing for half an hour. We'd get more done than if we tried to do both of them together for the hour. I think the best technique for that, the problem is that notifications are designed to grab your attention. And actually, that is one thing that we think is fairly inbuilt, is that there's a type of attention that we can't ignore. So if there is a loud noise behind you, your head will turn to see what it is. And we can't not do that. It's built in to protect us. So these beeps and flashes and bings are designed to grab our attention, and that pulls our focus away from whatever else we're doing. I think the best way to deal with it is, unless that thing really is vital, just turn off. If you want to really focus on something, turn off your notifications. And there's a technique called the Pomodoro technique that some people might have come across, where you do 20 minutes and you set a timer and you say, for 20 minutes, I am doing this thing. And you kind of start thinking, well, is there really any notification that is so important that if I ignored it for 20 minutes, something really bad would happen? And there probably are a few cases. If you've got family caring responsibilities, if a baby's crying, you can't ignore that for 20 minutes. But in a work situation, if you ignore your emails for 20 minutes, is anything really bad going to happen? And would you just get more focused work done? Yeah, so that's one thing to think about.
That's really, really useful. Thank you so much for your time today, Ginny. We've just got one more question. I think from Atambai. Sorry if I pronounced that incorrectly. How long is best for learning at a time? So what sort of segments of time would you recommend for periods of learning?
It's going to really vary depending on the age of the person and basically their personality, and then also the time of the day. So I know for me personally that my brain works best in the morning, and in the morning I can probably do a half hour, 45-minute stretch of really focused time before I need to stop and get a cup of tea. But if it was 10 o'clock at night, there's no way I could do 45 minutes in one go. So it's quite a personal thing. When it comes to younger kids, they've got shorter attention spans, so they're going to need more breaks. It also probably depends on the type of learning you're doing. So there are some things where people can get into what we call a flow state. And this tends to happen with things like art or music. It can also happen with like computer coding, anything that is really kind of immersive. And people get into this amazing state where it's almost like time disappears and stops, and they're so immersed in what they're doing. And sometimes people come out of it and they're like, oh, wow, it's 3 hours later. I had no idea. So it really depends on the type of work. I would say if you're starting to feel like it's really difficult, that probably means you need a break. If you always feel like that, then for sort of adults or teenagers, I'd maybe say the Pomodoro thing, say 20 minutes. That's generally quite an achievable thing. Even if you start feeling a bit like, oh, it's dragging, you can look at your timer, you've probably only got 7 minutes left to go. That feels quite achievable. And then you can start building it up, because I think people often build up things they don't want to do as feeling worse than they actually are. And if you can just get them started, even if it's 5 minutes, once they've done those 5 minutes, they'll be like, oh, that wasn't too bad. And then they can start building it up. So yeah, that wasn't super helpful because it's going to be really variable from person to person, but that's kind of where I would approach it from.
Absolutely. Tim to my left, who used to be a teacher, was nodding away there. So I think there's a certain recognition, but no, thank you very much. As Jay says in the chat,
if anyone wants to ask any more questions that we didn't have time for, you can find me on social media, Braintastic Sci or Ginny Smith Sci is my personal one. And we've got actually a learning and memory lesson plan. So if you'd like to teach any of this stuff to your students, if you head to our website and go to the freebies page, we've got a whole lesson plan with a little video intro, some activities, some of the ones you did today that you can run with your students to help them understand their learning and memory as well.
That's fantastic. Yes, I've posted a link to Ginny's website in the chat, which has got all her social handles as well. Just to answer a question as well, this will be this entire session has been recorded and will be posted in the STEM Spotlight group, which we'll send the link round. Yeah, we've all got plenty to think about this evening about dancing kettles and all manner of things. But thank you so much, Ginny. I've certainly found that really interesting. I know everyone else did, and really good to see you. And thank you to everyone for joining. We'll put the recording in the Spotlight group, and we'll speak to you all soon. Thanks very much.
Thanks. Bye.